Here's a nonsensical attempt to refute atheism in 10 words.
The argument from dependency can be used to make an irrefutable case for God's existence. It goes like this. Everything we observe in the known universe is dependent.
That doesn't actually seem to be the case. In fact, I don't think it makes sense to say it applies to everything in the known universe. Part of the known universe is time, and I don't think it's coherent for time to be dependent. For a thing to be dependent, I think there has to have been, or at the very least hypothetically could be, a time when it didn't exist or wouldn't exist. This isn't possible with time. There never was, nor could there ever even hypothetically be, a time at which time does not exist. In that sense, time has always existed. The same might be the case for space, since it has a connection to time. When has space ever not existed?
When we say that something is dependent, we mean that its existence and the properties it has requires an explanation outside of itself. To argue otherwise is to imply that these things gave rise to themselves.
No, it isn't. Something that has always existed, like time, doesn't need to give rise to itself, nor does it need anything else to give rise to it. You can't give rise to something that already exists. And there has never been a time when time has not already existed. Even if time has only existed for a finite extent, since the earliest moment in time was not preceded by any point in time, I don't think it makes sense to speak of it as having been created. There was never a time when it didn't already exist.
This is like saying that something both exists and does not exist at the same time, which is obviously an absurd proposition. A good example to help demonstrate this principle is a triangle. The triangle's property of the number of angles cannot vary. It can never be anything other than 3, because triangle means having 3 angles. So by its very definition, a triangle is a thing that has 3 angles. This property of having 3 angles is explained by the very existence of there being a triangle.
No, it's explained by the fact that human beings came up with the concept and stipulated that it has 3 angles. This would be the case even if nothing in the universe existed that was even vaguely triangular.
By contrast, the triangle's property of colour can vary. Similarly, the lengths of its sides can also vary, as they can be longer or shorter. The size and colour of the triangle are properties that are not explained by the mere existence of the triangle. Hence, triangles in the physical world are dependent things, because we must look to an explanation that is external to the triangle in order to explain its existence. If we apply these same principles to the universe, then we come to the conclusion that it is dependent, because it too has properties that could be different to how they currently are.
Does it, though? I don't think we actually know that to be the case. We can imagine it as having different properties, but that doesn't mean that it actually ever could have had those properties.
For example, the number of stars and planets it contains. This raises the question, how did the universe come to be? What explains it? The explanation for the universe cannot be anything that is dependent. Otherwise, we end up in a situation where the explanation requires an explanation, which does not explain anything. Besides, trying to use something that requires an explanation to explain something that requires an explanation will never give us any answers, as it leads to an infinite regress of explanations, which is absurd.
I don't think it is. I don't believe that there necessarily is an infinite regress of explanations, but even if there is, there's nothing absurd about that. As Bertrand Russell once said, there's no logical problem with a series with no first term. There's no logical reason why there can't be explanations all the way down. Or it might be the case that the universe's existence is just a default state of reality, or what philosophers sometimes call a brute fact that has no further explanation.
Think of a line of dominoes that goes on forever. You will never arrive at a point where they stop falling. We conclude that whatever explains the universe must itself be independent. Now, not only does it have to be independent, it also has to be eternal. In fact, independent things are by their definition eternal.
What do you mean by eternal? If eternal just means has always existed, then time is eternal. If eternal means has existed for an infinite amount of time, then it doesn't look like anything is eternal, because time only seems to go back about 13.7 billion years to the Big Bang.
If they're not eternal, then it means they have a beginning, and things with a beginning need an explanation.
Things that have ever at some point in time not existed might need an explanation, since one could quite reasonably wonder what caused the change from the time that it didn't exist to the time that it did, but I don't see why something that has existed at all points in time, even if time is past finite, needs an explanation. Thus, I don't see why space-time would need an explanation. I don't see why it would need to be created by a god.
That is to say, they are dependent upon something external to explain why they came into being. So how does the Quran relate to all of this? The 112th chapter of the Quran defines this independent, eternal existence as Allah.
قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ
Say, He is Allah, the One.
اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ
Allah is He on whom all depend.
لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ
He begets not, nor was He begotten.
وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ
And there is none comparable to Him. Allahu Samad, which means that Allah is He on whom all depend, highlights Allah's independence.
How could time depend on him, though? If there never was, nor even coherently could be, a time when time does not exist, what would it even mean for the existence of time to be dependent upon something causing that existence? It seems to me that everything depends upon space and time. I don't understand what it means to say that something exists if it doesn't exist at some location and at some time. That's why I don't understand what it means to say that a God exists. How could something exist without that existence being dependent upon space and time?
And lem yelid wa lem yulad, which means He begets not, nor was He begotten, implies eternality. We can see that in less than 10 words, the Quran describes our Creator in a way that provides an irrefutable argument for His existence.
I think an argument would have to be coherent before it could be irrefutable.
Allah is the independent, eternal reality that explains the origin of life, the universe, and everything. Atheists might respond by claiming that the universe is eternal and therefore it does not require an explanation. This does not help them because an eternal universe still has certain properties that could be different to how they are.
Again, we don't know that to be the case.
Therefore, there must be something external to the universe that explains its physical properties. Hence, even an eternal universe is dependent. To help illustrate this, let's take the example of an eternal red triangle. The fact that the triangle has existed forever does not stop it from requiring an explanation for why it's red and not another colour. It does not matter whether the thing we are discussing is a triangle or universe. Nothing magically becomes independent just because it is eternal. Another response that atheists might put forward is that science will eventually come up with an explanation that does not require God. This is actually not the case, as the argument from dependency is a metaphysical argument. Metaphysical arguments are based on first principles which transcends all science.
As best as I can tell, it is a metaphysical first principle that something which has always existed cannot be created. Since time has always existed, the idea that time is dependent upon a creator seems to me to not only be physically impossible, but also logically contradictory.
If you deny first principles, then it has logical implications that lead to a worldview based on absurdity. You can bring any scientific theory now or in the future, and this metaphysical argument will still be valid. Science can only refer to things that are dependent because it relies on observations.
I don't need science to point out the problems with the argument from dependency, because those problems are conceptually inherent to it and can therefore be understood a priori.
If you can observe something, then you are dealing with a dependent thing, because it need not have existed, or could have existed in a different way, i.e., with potentially different properties. One final challenge posed by atheists is to ask, why can't the eternal independent cause behind the universe be some blind unconscious process? Why should anyone believe that it has a will at all? In response, simply put, since the universe could have been otherwise, then it stands to reason that a decision maker is required to determine its existence from non-existence and decide which properties it has out of other possible properties.
Again, we don't know for sure that the other properties we can imagine are in fact possible. Also, this argument assumes that the decisions made by decision makers don't have causes. This does not seem to be the case. When we make decisions, we make them for reasons, which is another way of saying that we have motivations that cause those decisions and explain those decisions. Those decisions are dependent. To say otherwise is to say that we make the decisions we do for no reason.
The ability to choose is the characteristic of a being that has a will and is fully conscious. This independent, eternal being that chose to create is whom we Muslims call Allah.
Not only does this argument assume that consciousness is non-deterministic, which is a baseless assumption, it also assumes that consciousness is the only thing that acts non-deterministically, which is also baseless. If there is anything which can happen without a cause, it's not clear that conscious, willed decisions fit that description. And even if they do, I don't think we can rule out that other events can also happen without cause. It also poses a weird theological question. If God's decisions are not caused, then doesn't that mean that he chose to create the universe for no reason? What could possibly be the difference between an uncaused decision and a decision made for no reason? To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.